What's going on, guys? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today I'm going to be building one of the smallest x86 PCs that I've ever attempted to put together. Basically, this system is going to be used for emulation. It should emulate up to Wii U. I have tested the same CPU in another build I did, and it did a decent job. Over time, all of these new emulators like RPCS3, which is a PS3 emulator, SimU, which is a Wii U emulator, and Citra for 3DS, are getting better and better. They're starting to run on lower end hardware really well. So for this build, I'm going to go with another Ryzen. This is a Ryzen 3 2200G. And I also have a Ryzen 5 2400G. The only issue here is heat and my power supply. So if everything goes well with the 22 and I have a little extra juice to spare, I'm going to go with the 2400G. For my power supply, I'm using a cheap 150 watt Pico power supply. I'm not sure if this is really going to put out 150 watts or not, and that's one of the reasons I want to go with the 22 first. Out of all of my other tests with 2200G Ryzen CPUs, the maximum I've ever drawn was 106 watts from the wall using a kilowatt meter. Now I know they're not completely accurate, but as long as this thing puts out 120 watts, this 2200G will perform perfectly in this small PC. Before I start the build, I'm going to go over all of the parts that I'm using here. I'll also leave Amazon links in the description if you're interested in doing something similar like this. First up, we have the case. This is a MoreX 557 Universal Mini ITX case. It's super small. It's actually 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches by 2.4 inches tall. It's nothing special, doesn't come with any fans. It has two USB 2.0 ports on the front, but I wanted the smallest case possible for a build like this, and this is what I found on Amazon. Runs about 50 bucks. For the motherboard, I'm going to go with this Gigabyte board again. They're relatively cheap. You can get them for about $79 refurbished. This is the Gigabyte AB350N, gaming Wi-Fi, has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in. The only issue with getting a board like this, a B350 chipset, is sometimes you'll get them and it has an older BIOS. It will not be compatible with the 22 or the 2400G. This is actually the third motherboard exactly like this that I bought. Two of them were refurbished and they both came with the newer BIOS that's compatible with Raven Ridge. It is possible to get one of these motherboards here and it's not compatible with Raven Ridge. You will have to put in an older AMD CPU to upgrade the BIOS, so be careful. I've already touched on this a little bit. First up, I'm going to go with the Ryzen 3 2200G APU, and if everything goes well, I'm going to switch over to the Ryzen 5 2400G. The 2200G has 4 cores clocked at 3.5 GHz. It will turbo up to 3.7, and it also has a built-in GPU. It's a Radeon Vega 8 GPU. The Ryzen 5 2400G is a bit more powerful than the Ryzen 3, but it does draw more power, and it creates more heat. To keep everything cool, I went with some Noctua products. For the CPU, I'm using the NHL9A AM4 low profile cooler. If you've never messed around with any of the Noctua products, they are hands down some of the best on the market. This cooler here is super low profile, and I'm really hoping it's going to keep everything cool in this small case. Now, I have used this exact cooler in the past and it worked fine, but it was in a much larger case. It wasn't closed off so much. The Ryzen 3 does come with a Wraith fan and cooler. It's a really good little setup, but it will not fit inside of the case I want to use. I'm also going to need some extra fans inside of this case to pull some hot air out. So I went with 2 Noctua 40mm fans. Now this case that I'm using will accommodate 4 of these, but they get a little expensive. These are about $16 a piece. Hopefully 2 does it. If not, I will add another 2, but I'm really hoping we can get by with the ones I have. And finally, the RAM I'm going to be using. This is Vengeance LPX DDR4 3600 MHz RAM. I'm only going with 8 gigabytes. These Ryzen APUs perform much better with faster RAM because it doesn't have any built-in video RAM. It's going to be using this as its VRAM. So theoretically, faster RAM is going to equal better video performance out of the built-in GPU. And finally, the power supply. So this 12 volt brick here is 12.5 amps. It should do 150 watts out of the wall. It's going to plug into the Pico power supply. The spec sheet claims 165 watts. Now, even if I can get 120 out of this, it's going to be perfectly fine for the 2200G. This is the first time I've ever messed around with one of these cheap Pico power supplies. In the past I have used an HD Plex, but I didn't want to spend a ton of money getting this up and running. The price is already up there because I'm trying to get it as compact as possible. If I was to use an ATX motherboard and a full-size case that comes with the power supply, I could knock $100 off the top of everything I have here. The cooler I have does come with some thermal paste, and it's perfectly fine for an application like this, but I do have a lot of this Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut laying around, so I'm going to be using this instead of the paste that came with the cooler itself. One thing I forgot to mention was the hard drive. I do have a 500GB drive that I'm going to be running all of my games from. I'm also going to be using a cheap 64GB Kingston M.2 SSD to run the operating system from. So I was going to do a full build tutorial, but there are thousands of build tutorials on YouTube and the internet, so if you don't know how to build a PC, you can follow one of those. I've just placed the CPU in the socket, added some thermal compound, and mounted the CPU cooler. Adding the RAM now. 8GB of Vengeance LPX 3600MHz RAM. Now I have had a few crashes when I run this RAM at 3600MHz on other systems, so I usually just underclock it to 3400MHz, and I've never had any trouble with that. So this is it. It has a very tiny footprint. It's going to fit in this case perfectly. The case itself measures in at 7.5 by 7.5 by 2.4 inches tall. It is a super small case. It's so tight in here that I actually had to remove the power switch from the case so I could get the board in. I'll have to re-add the power switch after I have everything mounted in. I thought about placing the 40mm fans in before I did anything, but I think I need to mount this first and then see how much room I have to work with. Alright, so it fits in here. I'll have to put the power switch back in. I'll probably have to remove the RAM to do that to get to the screws, but looks like the top's going to fit on. The case did come with a bunch of mounting hardware. I just need to get this motherboard secured in here. I'll put the power switch back on, then we'll add the power supply. And here it is. Everything fits in here pretty well. There's a little room to move some air around. Tried to get the wires as neat as possible in here. Unfortunately, all I had were some white zip ties. I still think it looks pretty good. I did throw the little Radeon sticker that comes with the CPU on the front. It's small. I mean, this thing is tiny. I also added some antennas for Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. These were the shortest antennas I had laying around that work with this. Here's a quick size comparison of a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus and a Flirt case side by side with the PC I just built. The unit is a lot smaller than I thought it would be. When I started ordering the parts, I had an idea of how big it would be, but this thing is tiny. On the far left is a small form factor Optiplex with an i5. Right in the middle is a Silverstone mini ITX case. As you can see, the ultra compact Ryzen build I just did is so much smaller than either of these. Moment of truth. First time booting up. Got an LED, fan spinning. It's running. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and plug this into my game capture. We're going to do some stress tests to see how hot this thing gets. Then I'll test a couple PC games and some emulators. Alright, so here we are. We're all booted up. I got Windows installed. This is not an activated version of Windows, but this will not affect performance whatsoever. I wanted to make sure everything was correct before I bought a license. So far, so good. I've had the system running for 15 hours. I just kind of let it idle here. I was messing around on the web browser. I installed a few games and things like that. But we're about to run Prime 95 for 35 minutes. This PC is going to be mainly used for emulation, and I will not max out all 4 cores like Prime 95 is about to do. I think 35 minutes is definitely going to tell me if it's going to overheat or not. Even running something like GTA 5 will not stress the system as much as Prime 95's gonna. I have the temperature listed, Prime 95's up, and CPU usage and uptime. I also have a watt meter connected to the wall so we can see how much power it's drawing when we max out all 4 cores. At idle, this is what it looks like. 26.7 watts. Now I know these aren't completely accurate, but I have seen this fluctuate anywhere from 15 to 32 depending on what the computer's doing in the background. And remember, this is idle here. This is not sleep. I'm going to keep an eye on this while Prime 95's running. I really don't want it going over 120 watts, and I don't think it's going to. I'm going to fast forward this. Alright, so after about 30 minutes of testing, 74.88 degrees Celsius. And for the wattage, I never saw it go over 106. I kept an eye on it. I was able to snap this picture here. I would trust this CPU up to 80 degrees Celsius. Now I know that's pretty hot, but I'm working with a very small case here. As long as I'm not thermal throttling, I will be perfectly fine with this setup here. I would have absolutely loved for this to come in cooler, but what I'm working with here is a low profile CPU cooler and a very small case with not a lot of airflow in there. There is no application that I'm going to be running that will stress out this CPU like we just did with Prime 95, so the temperatures will be much lower than this in everyday use. Even running GTA 5 1080p normal settings, it will not get as hot as it just did running Prime 95. Speaking of GTA 5, let's go ahead and test it out right now. I will have Afterburner listed up in the top left hand corner and Fraps in the top right hand corner. I'm not using the CPU or GPU to record from this. It's plugged into an external capture card, and all that work's being done on another computer. So we'll have no performance loss from that. Now, unfortunately, Afterburner or even the AMD built-in monitoring system will not display the CPU temperature in-game for some reason. I tried several different applications to get this up and running, and I cannot display the GPU or CPU temperature. I mean, they're on the same die, so even if I was to display the GPU, we'd still be getting the CPU temperature. Nothing that I have tested works with these Ryzen APUs. Now, I know I mentioned that this was built specifically for emulation, but there are some people out there that are going to want to play some PC games on a system they build like this. So I'm running this at 1080p, normal settings. If you went down to 720p, you could jack it up a little bit. And if you wanted to run this at a locked 30 FPS, you can go to high settings. You will have to tweak around with it a little bit, but it'll run at a constant 30 FPS, 1080p, high and medium mix settings. It's not a bad experience for a built-in GPU. I also wanted to test out some explosions here, just to let you see the performance with everything going on. There's a bunch of cars on screen, some fire going. In my opinion, GTA 5 is perfectly playable on a Ryzen 2200G. Next up, I wanted to test out some Dreamcast emulation using Redream. I'm going to go to my video settings and jack it up a little bit. 3200 by 2400 internal resolution. We're going to go with some Dead or Alive. If you don't overclock the 2200G, it will not run Redream at 4K. I've tried a bunch of games on a similar system, and the highest I can go without seeing any lag is 3400 by 2400, but it's not far off from 4K and it still looks amazing.
Get ready, fire!
As you can see, runs Dreamcast really well. Now I do have a list of systems that I have tested on the 2200G. I'll show you that at the end of this video. It is a very long list. There are tens of thousands of retro games that you can emulate with the 2200. Next up, some PSP emulation using PPSSPP, playing God of War Chains of Olympus. This is one of the hardest games to emulate using this emulator. 60 FPS. I do get a few dips every once in a while, only with this game, but I've tested a ton of different games with this, and it handles PSP fine. GameCube emulation using the Dolphin emulator. This is Soul Calibur 2. I'm at 4K, but I'm only recording in 1080p. It handles GameCube and Wii games really well. There are some games that won't handle 4K, you might have to drop it back a little bit. But overall, this system handles GameCube and Wii really well. And finally, some PS2 emulation. Now, I've done videos on this same CPU. I've also done a few videos on the 2400G testing Wii U and PS3 emulation. There are some games that run really well with both of those emulators, but both of those emulators are still relatively young, so over time it's only going to get better with lower end systems like this. Alright, so this build worked out pretty well for me. I don't think I need to upgrade to the 2400G, and if I did, I think we're sitting right there on it overheating. You could possibly add a couple more fans in here, but I don't think it's going to keep that 2400G cool enough. And to tell you the truth, I don't need much more than the 2200G can offer for emulation. I still haven't overclocked this system yet. I could go to 3.8 gigahertz very easily. I'm not sure how cool it's going to stay, but I don't think we're going to hit that thermal throttle while playing emulators at 3.8 gigahertz. So I made up a simple list here of all the emulators that I have tested on the 2200G over the last few months messing around with them. This is an awesome little CPU for an arcade build. You really don't need this much for an arcade, but if you're looking for new parts, the 2200G is perfect. So this is all of the systems that I have tested on a 2200G. I know there's a lot more that'll run on here, but this is what I've tested. And by the way, any front end's going to work on here. If you want to use a track mode, that's fine. If you want to use Hyperspin, it works. If you want to use Launchbox and Big Box like I do, it works fine on a system like this with 8 gigabytes of RAM. So here's a little list I've put together. Now for 3DS and Wii U, there are some games that run perfectly on here, but then you're going to run into some games that run like crud. It's just like most systems. I mean, it's really the emulator at this point. So we got ColecoVision, WonderSwan Color, Atari ST, Atari Lynx, 3DS, Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, Naomi, Master System, Sega Mark III, Game & Watch. TurboGrafx-16, Sega Genesis, Pinball FX, I know it's not an emulator, but it runs really well on this system. Philips Video Pack, CDI, PlayStation 1, Famicom Disk System, PC FX, PS2, Neo Geo Pocket, Neo Geo Pocket Color, Neo Geo CD, Neo Geo AES, Neo Geo MVS, SG-1000, NES, MSX2, another Sega Saturn for some reason, I didn't mean to put that in there twice, but Sega Saturn runs great. Atari 5200, Atari 2600, Atari 7800, arcade games, Nintendo DS, Apple II, Wii, Wii U, GameCube, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo 64, MS-DOS, and television, MAME. If it runs in MAME, it's going to run on here. Odyssey, Commodore 64, Commodore VIC-20, and Amiga. There are a lot of other systems that I have set up in Launchbox right now. I have not tested them, but I can tell you, if it came out before the PS2, this thing's probably going to run it. Another one I have not tested as of making this video is the Xbox emulator CXBX Reloaded. I just haven't had time to do it. Bottom line is, it runs everything I need it to run. If you're interested in building a Ryzen 2200G system, I suggest getting a mid-size tower case. This was just kind of an experiment I wanted to do to see how small I could get one of these systems. It did work out, but it cost a lot more than it would have if I just bought a mid-size tower. I've made a ton of videos on turning old Optiplexes into nice emulation setups for under $200, and you can go out and do that if you want to, but you're not going to get this form factor. Overall, I spent $540 on this. After tallying everything up, I was blown away by how much I actually spent on building this unit here. I'm not sure why it's so expensive to build something this small. Now, if you were to go out and buy a mid-size case that came with a power supply and fans, you could cut those out of the equation right off the bat. You can get cheap cases that come with a power supply and fans for about $19.99 on eBay or Newegg when they have sales going on. That's going to automatically cut off $140 on the top of all of this. And if you have a hard drive laying around, you can cut that out of the equation also. So you can get away building a 2200G system relatively cheap, but if you want to go super small form factor, it's going to cost you. So overall, I think this mini Ryzen powered emulation PC came out pretty well. It's a little more than I wanted to spend, but to get that form factor, you do have to fork out a little more money. If you're interested in building something similar, I'm going to leave links to everything I used in this build in the description. It's all available on Amazon or Newegg. Another route you could take is just buy a cheap i3 or an i5 Optiplex with 8 gigabytes of RAM. You can find them all over Craigslist. Some college auctions have them all the time with 3rd and 4th generation i5s. And throw an NVIDIA GT 1030 in there. It's going to perform really well in PC games. I've actually done a build like that. I have a video on screen now and in the description. Really appreciate you guys watching. If you could, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and like always, thanks for watching.